So, hi, and welcome to Poetry Passages. I'm Clifford Rames, and I'm super excited to be here with the one and only Billy Collins. Hi, Billy.
Hi, how are you?
Well, I have to say, this is a total honor, and I'm actually a little bit starstruck. I can't believe
Well,
you're
you're
right
the
there.
one and only Clifford Rain, so I mean you can say that pretty much about anybody.
Right?
But
Well, anyway, you can
thanks anyway.
pinch me and wake me up. Um, so I kind of feel like you need no introduction, but for anyone who may be just coming around to poetry, I'm going to give a little one for you right here. And this is the official part. So Billy Collins is the author of 12 collections of poetry, including his newest release from Random House, Musical Tables. He is also the editor of three anthologies, Poetry 180, Poetry 180 More, and Bright Wings, an illustrated anthology of poems about birds. And I love that one. Often overlooked, but no less intriguing, are a book of haiku called She Was Just 17, and a children's book called Voyage, which I happen to have right here. Look at that beautiful cover. Unfortunately, I don't have your haiku book. I believe it's out of print, but it makes me sad. But it's out there for anyone who's lucky enough to have it. A former distinguished professor at Lehman College of the City University of New York, Billy Collins served as Poet Laureate of the United States from 2001 to 2003, New York State Poet from 2004 to 2006, and he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters in 2016. Now, just as an example of the staying power of Billy Collins, in 1999, the New York Times declared him to be the most popular poets in America, followed by the Wall Street Journal, who in 2013 pronounced him America's favorite poet. Based on the success of the new book and the sold out readings that Billy has been doing lately, I would hazard to guess that America still has you, Billy, in a poetry bear hug. And I'm sure the adoration doesn't stop at the US border. I suspect you have a huge international following as well, right?
Well, some translations in
Yeah.
several languages. I'd say some of which I don't know what language they are in, a couple of them anyway. And I took one to my dry cleaner who I thought was Albanian, but he just gave me a strange look. It didn't make any sense to him either. So I stopped asking people because it can be potentially lead to insulting people. But
Well, I hope to see a Billy Collins book in Croatian someday. Anyway, that makes us all so lucky to have you with us today. And just again, thank you so much for coming on the program. So, how does it feel to be America's favorite poet? And what is it like being Billy Collins or a day in the life of Billy Collins?
well, I don't, I don't wake up and think about that. Thank God. I don't know. I've got other sources of self-esteem besides what the press regards me as being. Um, Seamus Heaney said that he was a poet just part of the time, and that I think goes for all of us. But he was smart enough to say it. And when he's reading or writing poetry or thinking about a poem, he's a poet. But when he's just putting down fertilizer or buying a dozen eggs, he's not a poet. All we're not poets all the time, and so that I mean the thought of like these epithets like most popular poet. The only time I think about those is when I hear them in introductions such as yours. I just feel vaguely embarrassed, but so yeah, I'm thankfully and unaware of. I don't stand on any of that, and I don't
Hmm.
regard. It's what they call the fraud theory. That the more successful you are, the more you doubt yourself
Right.
because you realize, well, they don't really know me. And it's like I think of that moment. I hope this is true. But James Joyce was at a party, and and a man came over to him and adulated him, praising him as this literary genius, and said to Joyce, "I wonder if you would permit me to kiss the hand that wrote Ulysses." And Joyce said, "Well, I suppose that would be okay, but I must tell you that it's done a lot of other things as well." So that's sort of the, I think, the artist versus the real life person.
Are there ever moments when you think you may never write another poem again, or
Oh yeah, of course,
and then you just
all
don't
the
have
time,
anything left? Yeah.
all the time. I
Yeah.
mean, you know, Frank Lloyd Wright used to say, asked, where do you get your ideas? He said, I just shake them out of my sleeve. And he's like a number of people who, and I'd say I'm somewhat like that sometimes, who try to make it sound easier than it is. That just poems just pop out of you, and but I'm full of, especially now that my work has kind of dwindled down, thanks to, or because of COVID. Really, even though I've always been attracted to really, really short poems, ever since I discovered haiku or even heard nursery rhymes. But COVID kind of produced these, got out of me these very short poems, and I didn't seem to be able to get past these little sprints. And yeah, and now one of my anxiety now is that I feel possibly stuck there, and I'm trying to get back to writing longer poems, but I find I become a small poem machine. That I'll start a poem and it doesn't have the promise of development. It just kind of bites itself on it grabs its own tail with its mouth and hangs on.
Well, and speaking of small poems, I want to congratulate you on the new book, Musical Tables. And I did hear that it did I hear correctly that it very quickly went into a second printing soon after release,
And then after, just a week later, into a third
and
printing.
then a third printing.
Yeah,
Wow,
so that's, and I think it's still in the third printing. So
right. So, would you like to get us in the mood with a couple of poems right now?
sure, yeah. So this is the book called
Yeah.
Musical Tables, and it's the only. Well, I'll just start by saying it's the only book where I've written a foreword or an afterword in this case, because I think the poems in all my books, as anyone would wish, are self-explanatory, except for someone like T.S. Eliot, who insisted on footnotes to The Wasteland. But in this case, I thought I had to justify or comment on the unusualness of the book, because if you pick it up and just flip through it, you'll see a lot of space, blank space, and you might even feel like you've spent too much money for the book, in terms of just getting your word power there. But let me just give you a little sample of some of them, and I'll just read them and go from one to the other. 3 a.m. Only my hand is asleep, but it's a start. The pauses are good, right?
Mhm.
Motel parking lot. Saying goodbye is so sad. I don't even bother to turn around to see what it was you just threw at me. Carbon dating. He tried it once as a last resort, but most of the women were a million years old.
Wow.
And the title of this one is, believe it or not, doesn't really sound like a title. The title is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Trouble was not his middle name.
Love that
So
one.
they get quite short. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I'll read one more if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
This is a little more. Well, here's a kind of literary one that's called Flaubert. As he looked for the right word, several wrong words appeared in his window. So that's the way they go, and they or
Yeah.
don't go.
I love
That's
the
that's
3 a
the
the 3 a.m. one is actually on the back cover for anyone who wants to take a
right.
peek. I don't know what it is about my brain, but sometimes I look at this poem and I see it in reverse, where it says like only my body is asleep, but my hand is writing this poem.
Well,
which, which got me wondering, do you ever wake up in the middle of the night and kind of scribble a poem on a bedside notepad?
yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And I tell whenever I've taught, workshops or a class in poetry, I always tell listeners to, if you don't write it down, if you think you won't remember it in the morning,
Yeah.
you think you will, but you
You
won't.
never do. Yeah.
But if you go back to sleep and don't get up and write it down, you probably don't have the makings of a poet. You don't have the sense of this could be something. This could
Absolutely.
work. And if you just let those kinds, it's a bad habit to let those things go by,
Mm,
whether you're in bed or just walking around. And therefore, always good to have a notebook with you,
mm.
something to write on.
Well, not only are you a great writer of poetry, but you're also a great reader of poetry, and which reminds me to mention that there's also an audiobook version of musical tables, correct?
Correct.
And as someone who loves to read poetry out loud here on Poetry Passages, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what makes a good poetry reader. What do public readers of poetry get right, and what do they get wrong?
Well, just a couple of a couple of very tactical or practical things. You have to make friends with the microphone.
Mm-hmm.
You have to figure out, especially if you're able to have a little sound test in the beginning. You have to see if the microphone is hot or not. In other
Mm-hmm.
words, are your P's and all other plosive sounds going to pop? And if they are, you can take the microphone and just put it instead of here, you put it next to your cheek, not touching, and your voice will transmit. I mean, that kind of thing, or just stand back from it a little bit. Let's see. And point number two: don't laugh at your own stuff. If you are attempting humor, do not laugh, because if you do, the audience feels it doesn't need to laugh, and it
Right.
just it's just like laugh at your own jokes, and read very slowly. I suggest pausing between the title and the first line for a couple of seconds. Like the title of this poem is From a Railing, so I would say, from a railing, a long barge with a helpful tugboat. See what I mean? Because the usually when one reads, one gets faster as you read. So if you start fast, you're just going to end up going even faster. And since it's poetry, every word should count, and a slow reading will put equal emphasis and respectful emphasis on each word. And if you rush through it, it just sounds like bad prose. So that kind of thing. I don't know.
Yeah.
And bow at the end.
Oh, at the end.
So, I mean, just
I
because you can write good poems doesn't mean you could read them well. But
yeah,
but
yeah.
you can learn to. I was very bad when I started out, because you probably know this, that it's rather common knowledge that the number one phobia in the United States is public speaking,
Public speaking.
way beyond fear of snakes and spiders and earthquakes and
Mhm.
and what other horrors. Uh,
Yeah,
so
there's
it's basically an unnatural act to get up, and there's no preparation for it. Conversation, it certainly
mm,
isn't. Reading certainly isn't.
sure.
So anyway,
Yeah, it's I guess it's one of the trickiest things with public speaking is how do you connect with the audience? And yeah, I think it's there's that fine line between reading to an audience or reading for an audience or reading at an audience.
yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
think some people uh, try to ingratiate the audience through self-deprecation,
Mm,
and that backfires immediately.
yeah, yeah.
Because if you're just kind of looking down at your shoes and fumbling with your hat brim, like oh shucks, I'm not really that good. Uh, just at least pretend you have some, confidence in yourself.
Well, anyway, getting back to the book Musical Tables,
Yeah.
it is a wonderful book, a delightful mix, as you mentioned, of 125 small poems. And I find many of them are funny, but also tender, poignant, and even sad, and sometimes all at once. And they touch upon themes such as nature, animals, mortality, the folly of life, love, poetry, and music. I mean, there's really something for everyone in the book. But before we dive deeper into the book, I wanted to mention your very popular Facebook series, The Poetry Broadcast.
Hmm.
And I mention it because some of the poems that made it into Musical Tables you premiered on the Poetry Broadcast. I can kind of remember you sort of test driving a few of them that eventually
Hmm.
made it into the book. And that was fascinating and an honor for us who are watching to be a part of. For those who don't know, can you just tell us about the genesis of the Poetry Broadcast? When did you start it, and what prompted it?
Well, there were two elements that started: COVID and my wife, and not necessarily, well, sort of in that order. It was March 2020. I'm still doing it twice a week, which is kind of amazing to me. We're coming up on like the third year of it,
Mm-hmm.
and to think for the first year or so, I did it every day. I mean, I right through the weekend, but there was a blank there with COVID. I mean, time stopped, or at least twisted itself into some odd shape in March of 2020 here on the east coast of the United States, and that the moment of lockdown,
Mm-hmm.
where and my wife Susanna said, "You're going to have to find something to do with yourself." Uh, because there was no reading, no travel off to places to public speaking of the public reading of poetry. There was none of that, and we were indeed locked down. She followed Facebook. I had a great contempt for, or I didn't want to get anywhere near Facebook. It just seemed like a time suck to me because I underestimated it, because I sort of associated it with people who go have a pizza and then they have to tell everybody that they're having a pizza, and take a picture of the damn pizza, and then take a picture of like the pizza plate empty. I don't know. So this kind of inconsequentiality and trivia, um, that's what I associated with. But anyway, so I got over that. I got on Facebook and began to read poems on Facebook. And the first one I read for about 8 minutes. I just didn't know what the medium really was. And then it started to develop. I got a little more at ease with it. They were longer, and I did it every day at 5:30. I'm still doing it, 5:30 East Coast time, and and it went for just a half an hour, and I was still doing just a half an hour. Um, and the other thing was, there was a key moment where I try to have a theme usually, or make some order of it, rather than just here is 7 poems. And the key moment was when I read a number of poems about music, mostly about jazz. And I thought, well, I'll just play a little jazz at the beginning of the program. Well, that seemed to be such a obvious enhancement. And then I would end with a little jazz. So that became a feature of the program. And the other thing that filled it out was comments. I would go through the comments. I didn't look at them while I was talking or reading, but I would write down some interesting ones, or people from interesting places. Like not New Jersey or Georgia, but Finland and the Philippines, and people from all over the world. 34 or 37 countries we counted a while back. So then it took this shape of having a component, and a kind of mailbag component, and it more and more became like a little show.
Mhm.
And yeah, so it was. And I read my poems, of course, but I read I'd say half and half, mostly at least 50% are poems by other people.
Hmm. It's kind of a wonderful reminder that it's sometimes the spontaneous or the unplanned things that we do in life that kind of alter things and
Yeah,
change
well,
the course.
I'm doing one tonight. So
Yeah, tune in, everyone. I know I'll be there.
I know you're one of the most steadfast, faithful followers,
Oh,
Clifford.
well, it's so funny because I also started doing this around the same time. Just I set up my camera and sat at my little table in my backyard and read a poem to no one. And that's how I started Poetry Passages, because I was
Yeah.
like, okay, it's the pandemic. We're not going anywhere. I have all these poems I love. I want to share them with someone, so I'm just going to read them. And then
Right. And it's interesting to see how an audience actually develops by
yeah,
virtue
and people
of you
started saying,
seeing it.
"Hey, this is great. Thank you for
Yeah.
doing it." Yeah, so it's wonderful. So your book, it's got such a great title, an utterly charming cover of a cow on a couch, and forgive the puns there. But I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the story behind the title and the artwork.
Well, the titles of my books are never an attempt to sum up the book, or the title is never a doorway into the book
Mhm.
or a key to open the door of the book, or any other metaphor you want to use. The title is basically, for me, something catchy,
Mhm.
something that a person wandering through a bookstore might see and just feel like, I got what's in there. I mean, why is that? Like, I have a book called Horoscopes for the Dead, which I thought was had a little catchiness to it. But musical tables is a takeoff on musical chairs. So if you don't know, if you're too young to know what musical chairs was, that's probably gone out of style. If you have an iPhone 14, what are you doing playing musical chairs? But so it's an image of hopelessness, that if you just have tables, there's nowhere to sit down when the music ends, and then you just stand there, and the tables are in fact obstructive to any kind of circular movement around them. And the poem is 6 lines long: musical tables. No one knew what to do when the music stopped. Plus, the big tables were always in the way. But soon it became the new game, in spite of its pointlessness. Or was that the reason for its popular appeal? So there's the narrator at the end is what Clive James pointed this out about my poems. It's a tone, it's a persona that is guilty of faux naif. That's my French pronunciation. So fake naivete, right? So apparently I use that a lot. So when you have a speaker saying, "Was that the point of its popular appeal?" Well, he's pretending that the thing really exists. I guess is an example of that.
Well, I read the whole book at least twice from cover to cover, and I really have a number of favorites, some of which we'll talk about. But and there's also this wonderful blurb on the back by some guy named Paul Simon. I don't know. But could you read a couple more poems for us, and then we'll
Sure.
I have a
Let's
question
see.
for you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, here's one called COVID. COVID, another long day at home. I set my phone on airplane mode. Um, This is called 4 lines long. It's called Disappointing Freak Show. A bearded man, a one-headed chicken, a sailor with a tattoo, and a three-legged piano. This is called Bad Hotel. And the titles are very kind of essential to the poem. They're really, with poems this small, the title is a much more integral part of the poem than it would be with a longer poem, I feel.
Mm.
So, Bad Hotel. I told the woman from housekeeping who was eager to do my room to just come in and pretend I'm not here, which is exactly what I had been doing ever since I checked in. And then the next one next to it is Siren, like the myth of the sirens. So enchanting was her singing. I turned the boat around and tied her to my mast so as to enjoy her melodies as I sailed around this fascinating world. So that's a little reversal.
Well, and it's so great because when I said I read the book twice, I mean, it's pretty easy to do, and that's what's so wonderful about these poems is they're so accessible. You can just dive right in, and before you know it, you're halfway through the book, and you want to keep on going.
Well, it's interesting in that there are ways to read this book. I mean, I guess usually with a book of poems, you just read it. I don't know whichever way, but randomly. But here you can go right through it, but it is like kind of eating pretzels or whatever. You want to keep eating them, but another way to do it is to just read two or three at a time, and a lot of people have done that. Another way to read it, one couple I know, um, uh, she read the whole book to him, and at some point he read the whole book back to her,
Oh, that's lovely.
which is, I thought, very sweet and charming.
Yeah.
And
Did you?
they're very readable to a person. I mean, you can call someone up and read one, or you can, if it's 3 lines, you can write it out on an email or something.
Did you have are the poems kind of just randomly placed, or do you have an arc that you could have worked on, or is there an order that only you and your editor know, or
It's an order only I know. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, that's always the case.
right? Yeah.
Basically, it's an attempt to be non-thematic. So if there
Mm,
were two poems about like romantic breakups, I would by
okay.
all means keep them as far apart as
Right,
possible,
right.
so that when you go from one to the other, everyone has a kind of whiff of novelty about it, rather than
You don't know what to expect. Yeah,
working some kind of theme.
right. So you started to talk about the small poem format, and I guess my simple question is why small poems? What led you to the small poem?
Well, they're just fun to read. I think the small poem is an extension, or if one is drawn to small poems and enjoys them, and actually thinks of them as having the status of a genre, like haiku. I said in the afterword that they're like haiku, but there are no haiku has these rules to it, the syllabic rules and linear limits. But the small poem, I'm arguing for its status as a genre, has only one requirement, that it's not too long. So its requirement is just has to do with its length, or rather lack of length. But the reason a lot of people get into poetry rather than prose is, I think that, well, first of all, I think there are two very separate abilities, like musical instruments. I think if you can play the piano, it doesn't mean you can play the clarinet.
Mhm.
And something real. One of, I guess, the most insulting comment someone can make to a poet is, "Have you ever tried writing a novel? Have you ever tried writing a memoir?" Which means basically the subtext there is, "Have you ever thought of growing up and writing something serious that people can read and maybe you can even make money out of, and something with a story? We love stories. Well, we're not doing that, but." Um, where were we? Oh, so the reason I think people get into poetry, one of them is for the shortness of any poem. You know, the lyric poem takes up usually one page or sits on one page, maybe spills over to the next page. But poetry is short. The novel is long.
Mhm.
Art, you know, art is long. Life is short. Art is long, and but not. But poetry is not as long as prose. Can't put this together. Um, so the poet makes a very sudden appearance rather than the novelist who's there. I'm reading a novel now and really enjoying it, but I'm a pretty slow reader, and I'll be in this novel for another, 4 or 5 days, maybe a week. Maybe I read like 40 or 70 pages at a time. But a sonnet, I mean, the Shakespeare appears, like here he is, and number 137 doesn't give you a title. Reads it. If he reads it, it's maybe takes a minute and a half to read a sonnet, and he's gone. So it's like somebody riding up in a cowboy movie and like shooting up the town a little bit, and off he goes. Who was that guy? So then if you go like from the sonnet or the lyric poem, like to his coy mistress or Dover Beach, then if you start condensing farther and further down and refining it down, if that's the word, or just collapsing it to like 3 lines or 4 lines, then you have a real kind of quintessence of the brevity, the fabled ability of poetry to say big things in small areas. So I think it's very basic to what we think of poetry.
Yeah. I heard you say at a recent reading that as you get older, your poems are getting smaller and smaller. But you also said earlier that you were hoping to get back to longer forms. But I was wondering, are you any plans to do another book of haiku?
Um, I don't think I have enough of them, and I don't know what
Yeah,
yeah, I haven't thought about that.
no, no. Well,
I could do. I mean, I have about, I don't know, 40 or 50 small poems that
hmm
were written after the manuscript to musical tables was
hmm
turned in. So there might be another one of those, but I'd like to get back to
longer
writing
form.
longer poems. To getting
Mhm.
back, I don't know if I think I can get back there. I mean, actually have about 100 regular poems,
Do you?
uh, but I've got to look at them with a cold eye.
Yeah, I remember hearing a interview with Bruce Springsteen where he said for every 10 songs that end up on an album, there are another 40 or 50 that end up on the floor.
Yeah,
Never
yeah. Well,
recorded
that's
for.
why the Eagles' greatest hits is was one of the most best selling records of all time because there's no sludge in it.
Right.
It's like 10 top best selling songs. They're all great
All
songs.
great songs. Well, actually, in musical tables, you do have a couple of poems which are almost haiku or haiku in disguise, I should say. And those are Night Sky, which is on page 26, and View on page 44. I was wondering if you could read those for us.
Sure.
And I say they're almost haikus because they have that 3 line format, and they're actually 575 syllables, only you tacked on a title.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll start with View. In the summer sky, a cloud with its mouth open eats a smaller cloud. View. In the summer sky, a cloud with its mouth open eats a smaller cloud. Night sky. Lying on the beach after so much wine and talk, dippers everywhere. lying on the beach after so much wine and talk, dippers everywhere. So the Big Dipper is really hard to find sometimes. I mean, it's if you're looking at a night sky and you don't have you're not on top of a mountain in Peru with access to the Milky Way. You kind of usually you want to get located or oriented. You look for the Big Dipper, and often is that it? Well, that and it's an odd thing because it doesn't look like anything.
Right, right.
Now, someone came up with Dipper, and it's see the ladle, but I have a poem where I discover another constellation because it's called the pig, and there's the snout and the little trotters, and I admit that it would be very difficult to point this out to anyone else. So it's sort of a private constellation. But here, is that the Big Dipper? No, that's not. They see dippers everywhere, and it's supposed to be a romantic couple. Why after drinking wine and
Right,
talk, they're
you have
lying on the beach. It's a
have the
romantic
wine
moment, and they don't care where the dipper really is. Dippers are just
well,
everywhere.
after
There's
the
just
wine, yeah,
this
dippers everywhere. But
plentitude of dippers.
I also love the ambiguity of that word dippers because you can also interpret it as dipping in the water, right? You're on the beach, and
I wouldn't go there.
no.
You don't need, Clifford, you don't need to go there. You're working too hard. You're working too hard.
Reading too much into it. Okay.
Good Lord, you English majors.
The skinny dippers are everywhere. We had too much wine. Anyway, you talked about you wrote an afterword, and I did notice in the afterword you wrote that small poems are unlike haiku, and I was wondering about that sentence if you could have kind of elaborated on. I think you started to a little bit earlier.
Well, this haiku is known for creating a haiku moment where there's a single moment, really something happens. You can hear a train whistle, and you're looking at a flower, or often two very disparate things that are somehow joined beautifully in this moment that occurs in the speaker who hears the train whistle, sees the flower, and the combination of those two solidifies a moment, and the moment stands for his existence. I was here. Most haikus are like a kind of Kilroy was here, saying I was here, I saw it. In the haiku where the man planting radishes, the man picking radishes points our way with a radish. It's great. I mean, you can see the guy, and they're asking for directions, and he says it's that way with a radish in his hand. The man picking radishes points our way with a radish. So these don't really accomplish that.
Yeah, they do.
Having spoken of the beauty and the incandescence of these moments, you won't get it here. Some of them are closer because they're more reverent and they are focused on a moment. But a lot of them are much more cynical, and they have just a bit of hippity hop in them. And